guys, welcome back to Fake Fangs episode 3. Today's episode is called The Art of Bush Manipulation, and I'll be taking a look into episode 3 of FX's What We Do in the Shadows, Werewolf Feud. Let's talk. So, just a quick recap on the episode. The vampires get into a bit of an altercation with a pack of werewolves in the area, and we also get to see further into the life of Colin Robinson as we follow him around his workplace, and we meet another energy vampire called Evie Russell. So, the episode immediately starts with Laszlo giving us a tour of his topiaries out in the front garden, which he's fiercely protective of, and there seems to be this undeniable joy in him to show us something that he is so proud of, but it's completely unhinged. I think this is one of the first instances that we see of him being a bit of a sex maniac. To have the vaginas of women you've loved shaped into hedges in your front garden, it's just a bit deranged, isn't it? I mean, some people do shape women into their hedges, but it's more focused on their curves, their breasts or their bum, or just their general womanly shape. But to go all out and just have multiple vaginas in your front garden is only something that Laszlo could really do and just be completely serious about. I also just want to note, how the hell does he know so vividly what his mother's vagina looks like? So much so that he's able to shape it into a bush, pardon the pun. I feel like as if they stop holding back from here on out, and it really just throws us in the deep end with each character's ridiculous antics. This is also our first time seeing Sean. I think it's so hilarious that their relationship to begin with is so negative. Laszlo clearly doesn't think very much of him. He's in the middle of his tour and then he's interrupted by, "Yo, Laz!" and he sours immediately. He sags his shoulders and he gives a look of such annoyance. Sean then calls his wife a bitch and Laszlo says, "She ought to strangle you to death with your own sphincter muscle." And he says it with such venom and anger and clearly so viciously believes that. He then segues back onto his topiaries by talking about the fairer sex, which really shows the era that he's from. It's a very old-fashioned term and never used these days, but I think it really highlights that Laszlo, although having lived for a good few hundred years, still hasn't really lost his old gentlemanly ways. But this scene in general shows such a contrast with the modern day behaviours, at how Sean thinks of his wife when she's not around, and then how Laszlo doesn't abandon his ideals for this lad's mentality. I think that's what's so great about Laszlo, is that he's so consistent throughout. He stays stuck in his ways, which can sometimes be beneficial or sometimes just be detrimental to the situation, but I think that's what keeps him as a fandom favourite, because he is so reliable as the same old Laszlo. Oh yes, we get a lovely little Colin Robinson solo in this episode. I love how in the beginning he says, "That's an enthusiastic yes," in response to him being a morning person. He says it in the most deadpan, monotonous tone, and the humour is so fantastic. Colin Robinson really does bring a different type of quality to the vampire dynamic. I also love seeing him in his natural habitat at his office workplace. I work in an office myself, and these random, boring conversations are so accurate. I think people would just chat about any old thing to make the time pass quicker. But if the conversation is boring, it will feel like it's going on forever, paired with the fact that you're kind of stuck at your desk, there's not really an escape from these types of conversations, and you just have to let them happen. It's so funny that they've managed to warp this idea into something more supernatural, that the reason these people who have these conversations exist is because they're doing it to sustain themselves. I think it's quite brilliant. We only get this short introduction into how Colin's energy vampire life works before we meet Evie Russell. And Colin is so displaced as soon as he speaks to her. Even as the audience, we sense that there's something quite off about her. On first watch, I just put it down to maybe she's the attention-seeking type, and she's there to showcase that Colin's powers maybe aren't as effective on every person. But obviously, we learn that there's more to this, and that Evie herself is an energy vampire, but just exploiting a different type of energy to Colin. In only the third episode, we get another layer of depth into this world of energy vampires, and seeing these two characters work side by side is so amusing. I like how as soon as Colin works out that Evie is an energy vampire too, his immediate reaction is to fight. We do see Colin come into contact with other energy vampires in later episodes, and he seems to be pretty relaxed with them and can appreciate their company, so I wonder if this fighting back is Colin being territorial over his office space. Territory seems to be a theme of this episode. The house vampires are showing it in a bit more of an animalistic way, as the werewolves are half animals themselves. Colin is less physical about it, but he uses everything he can in his verbal arsenal to try and bring Evie down, like when we see them go head to head after everyone has left the office for the day. Although this altercation does have a much different outcome than the one between the house vampires and the werewolves. I'm so happy that werewolves exist in this universe. Of course, they went with the idea of if vampires exist in this world, then why can't other magical creatures? Vampires and werewolves seem to be a trope that we see time and time again. I might be wrong, but I feel as if Twilight is the culprit for this. We see all the werewolves together at one point, and Nadia does ask them if they are all Native American, which then they all start blaming Twilight for. Feuding supernatural beings seems to appeal to the masses, and there's no exception here. This show does regularly parody other vampire media, and it's nice to see an alternate take on the whole vampires versus werewolves trope. This show isn't afraid to laugh at itself, and I think that since this idea is so overdone these days, laughing at this kind of feuding is exactly what this trope needs. I also like that there's two opposing ideas here, with Laszlo wanting to kill the werewolf that got caught in his trap, but once again, Nandor is here trying to keep the order in the household. As we discussed in episode 1, Nandor is a complete stickler for the rules. He stamps his foot like a child saying no to the killing and immediately brings up the truce between vampires and werewolves to try and dissuade Laszlo from a quick revenge killing. I think it's so interesting how Nandor is seen as the one who obeys and follows the rules. I think it may be because he's the oldest person in the entire household, so he wants to possibly keep his authority over the rest of them. Or it may be because he's lived long enough to see what life is like to not follow these certain rules and keep the flow of things in the supernatural world. There is a side to Nandor that is deeper and interesting, and I feel like we get to see it here. On the outside, he's so childish and quite superficial. He's probably used to getting his way, as we learn that he was essentially like a king back when he was human. This still shows through when he stamps his foot like a child having a tantrum, but there's a reason for it. He so strongly feels that the werewolves should not be killed, even though it's still obvious that he hates them and he doesn't want to have anything to do with them. He really doesn't want conflict here, and this theme of Nandor's conflict avoidance keeps coming up. Although for this episode it is used for comedic purposes, in later episodes and seasons we find out that this side of him does slowly end up ruining and possibly destroying his relationships. So in this episode we really see the difference between regular vampires and energy vampires. Not only through actions, but through set design. Colin Robinson's worldview, although bland, is very bright. We also see him outside in a park when he's breaking up with Evie, and it's so jarring as we get very, very little daytime scenes in this show. The office itself is set in the daytime with lots of bright natural light, and if you separate these scenes from the show, the office itself would look so bleak and depressing, as the main colour here is grey, but when contrasted with the dark setting of the house, it looks brighter and a more positive space. I feel like this highlights the world Colin Robinson lives in. To anyone else, this would be a depressing place to live, but this is Colin's excitement. He gets to feed off this gloomy space, and to him, this is his bright world. Now, taking a look at the setting in the house, it's incredibly dark. The only light seems to be coming from the candles, and at first glance, this may seem like yet another dark, dreary, and possibly even scary place to be. However, there's actually so much colour in the darkness. The walls are a deep green, the candles are red, and there's many gold accents. The light from the candles themselves creating this warm and welcoming glow throughout the house. They have created this rich and comfortable inner world for themselves, which of course makes sense seeing as they're unable to venture out as and when they please during the day. These two different worlds for the vampires also seem to suit their personalities very well. Colin Robinson, although a very boring person, which is represented in the grey colours that seem to follow him, is still this open and carefree person, uncaring of what people think of him and going about his usual day, taking all the energy that he can for feeding on. The house vampires, who bicker with each other to no end and seem to be riled up over the smallest things, still have these very deep and complex personalities. Their eternal lives are still lived to the fullest while they are being their true, authentic selves, which is represented by the deep, rich colours that you can see throughout the house. Thank you guys for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Fake Fangs. If you liked this episode, then please follow me on Instagram at fakefangs_ for more content. And once again, thank you to my editor, Becky Gray, who you can also find on Instagram at Becky Gray Music Art. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you next time.